Hello everybody, in this video I will talk about how to differentiate ENTJ and INTJ types. So let's start. The first difference I see would be the drive for knowledge versus drive for power. This is not something you will always observe, but this is theoretically at least what you're supposed to observe. INTJ's dominant function is introverted intuition, which is a perceiving function, and ENTJ's dominant function is extroverted thinking, which is a judging function. And moreover, the perceiving function of INTJs is introverted, and that's why they are introverts, because their dominant function is introverted, and the thinking of ENTJs is extroverted. Which means that since the dominant function is supposed to be the strongest in the psyche, these two are theoretically at least completely different. So, how are they different? Well, INTJs, because of their intuition, spend more time thinking about things more than doing things. INTJs spend more time in their heads because of their dominant introverted intuition. Introverted intuition is a function that sees things, many people will say it's partly unconscious. This is not completely true. INTJs, many people say they are arrogant. They are arrogant for a reason. It's because they think they know things that other people don't know, which means that they are conscious to some extent of the use of their introverted intuition. So it's not a completely unconscious function. It is a very conscious function, but the way it works is a little bit weird to most people. It's intuition, but in your internal world, you travel in your ideas and you connect things, and this is a process that makes INTJs a little bit they think they are different from other people. All the people who have introverted intuition to some extent think they are different from other people because most people don't use that function, so they don't act like this. So back to INTJ versus ENTJ. Since INTJs have dominant introverted intuition, most of the time they just think about things. That's what introverted NI, that's what NI is about, thinking about things. So they can just sit on a chair and spend like 1 hour thinking on a certain subject that maybe while on the other hand, extroverted thinking is an extroverted judging function. This is, you have to think of it as, I've seen a lot of times the image of a bulldozer to represent it. I think it's a bulldozer or something like that. The big engine, the big thing that destroys walls and things like that. And the aim of this function is, many people talk about facts and data and whatever. Yeah, maybe. The thing is, the main aim of this function is to act. just act, but not act like extroverted sensing, you know, because you will see a lot of ESFPs and ESTPs doing things a lot of the time. They're not really doing things because of their SE, they're just perceiving things, and because they don't have the judging component, they just, you know, they just perceive, and they keep, it's like the rabbit that keeps running after the, anyway, ESFPs and ESTPs, they just perceive, and that's why they look like they're acting. They just perceive, they keep perceiving, they just keep running after things, but they don't act, they just run after things. Extroverted thinking is the function that wants to act. So the big difference between the first and biggest difference between the typical INTJ, because there are INTJs with ENTJ tendencies and there are ENTJs with INTJ tendencies, but the biggest difference between the textbook, the INTJ of the descriptions and the ENTJ of the descriptions would be that INTJs spend more time perceiving, while ENTJs spend more time acting. There are a lot of people who will underestimate this difference, and they will just say, no, there are INTJs who act, but this is false. I mean, if they did, then their NI wouldn't be their first function, you know. So, wouldn't make any sense. The first function is the one you use the most. If you spend 90% of your time acting, you can't be an introverted intuitive dominant. That doesn't make any sense. So that would be the first difference. Okay, so the next difference would be, so you're gonna think it's the second function, but I was thinking more about, because we've talked about the first function, NI versus TE, it would be the same, it would be symmetrical. I'm just gonna say TE is lower in INTJs and NI is lower than INTJs, and TE versus NI is the same thing as NI versus TE. So you get that. I'm not gonna repeat myself. The next difference would be the tertiary spot. So it would be tertiary FI in INTJs and tertiary SE in ENTJs. So what's the difference here? The difference is the role of this function. If you just think of it as a lower function, then you don't get the need of discussing it. You're just gonna say, yeah, it's the same thing as it's just FI versus SE, but it's in the third spot. That's not the whole story. There is something more to say about this. The third function, at least that's my perspective on it, you may or may not agree on that, but the third function, I think, is a wannabe function. It's the function that sometimes you want to let in, and it takes you over. And the third function is, it's called the hidden agenda in socionics. Now, as socionics is not MBTI, obviously there are some differences between the two. I think in socionics, SE would be, extroverted sensing would be a mix between the actual SE of MBTI plus the TE, because SE in socionics has a bit of a component of power, and which MBTI SE doesn't have. So I'm not using the concept of hidden agenda. I'm just using, though I could, to some extent there is a certain parallel that you can draw between the two, but even if you don't use socionics, you can just think of it as a wannabe function. Because in socionics, the concept of hidden agenda is the function that you secretly aspire. And you can translate that to some extent in MBTI, because with the concept of wannabe function, if you want to call it this way. So what is the wannabe function? How I see it is the rise of a certain part of yourself that you don't want to consciously express, but you can't really completely repress. It's like an urge. You have the urge to do something. This is the tertiary function, when you don't know why, but you just want to do it. So in INTJs, the urge of FI means that, and the third spot, when it happens, takes the, it's like it takes, to some extent, it takes the place of the first spot, and the first and second spot, they just disappear. So the INTJ would become something like a mix between INFP and ISFP when they are in that mood, while the ENTJ would become something like ESFP and ESTP. So that's why you will see INTJs that mistype themselves to some extent for INFPs and ISFPs. It happens sometimes. And you will also see some ENTJs that sometimes mistype themselves for ESFPs or ESTPs. Because ENTJs are primarily thinkers, they will more mistype themselves for, if it even happens, they will more mistype themselves for ESTPs than ESFPs, and because INTJs are primarily intuitives, they will more mistype themselves for INFPs than ISFPs. So typically when this happens, when you have this wannabe function that for some reason has the urge to take the first spot, the INTJ becomes an unhealthy version of an INFP, and the ENTJ becomes an unhealthy version of the ESTP. So if you want to see the difference between INTJ and ENTJ, you can also look at the differences between INFP and ESTP. It's, to some extent, you can see the differences also in that case. INTJs, they have that FI, which is very strong, even though it's third, but the third function is still strong. As I said, sometimes you have the urge to let it express at the first spot, and they become overly emotional, or they want to express themselves, or they want to tell you the truth. They want to tell you something that concerns them, anything that can be related to FI. Anything that can be related to FI. While ENTJs, when this happens, they become a certain version of, they don't become in the meaning of completely changing their type, but they start to act like an ESTP. And so what happens is they become a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more in the moment. They focus on practicality, but not in the, because ENTJs by default focus on practicality via TE. But what I mean by practicality is that they don't even think of the applications of the idea. They just want to do it, like ESTPs by default mode. ESTPs, as I said, they just run to do things. They don't really want to act on a certain purpose. They're perceivers. They just act for no reason. So when ENTJs become ESTPs, they have, when the tertiary SE takes place in the first spot, replaces the first function, the same phenomenon happens in the unhealthy ESTP, which means that they just act and for no reason.